So for all the people present here, I think the topic which was given for me to speak on was more in terms of understanding the opportunity, right, and moving early, BPO, right, that's what we talk about. All my learned colleagues throughout the morning till now have been speaking about how technology enabled this entire industry to flourish, right? And from a perspective of where it is today and where it is supposed to go tomorrow, how does the entire set or the stack of technology tools, be it artificial intelligence, be it machine learning, be it any that you may have, is going to help us get there. So I'm not gonna keep it very, very tech heavy, and I know that we've kind of just come back from our lunch, so I'm gonna just try my level best to keep your attention to as much possible, right? All that I'm gonna talk about is when we say what and how are we headed towards the next era of BPO. But there's a lot to talk about, right? When we talk about the future readiness, we're talking about, what are we talking about? Are we talking about process? Are we talking about tool set? Are we talking about, your method, or what is it, right? And from a perspective of looking at maybe alternate views, right? On your left side on the slide, you see what we're talking about is the NASSCOM view and the NASSCOM priorities for 2023-24, where they're talking about revamping and coming out with a set of core areas, focus areas for this industry. So moving from a BPO to a BPM, right? One of the things that many of you guys as leaders alluded upon a while back in your presentations. But that's one side of it that we're talking about, and there's a whole gamut, right? And on the other side is the traditional organizational way of operating, right? We start off with having an operational excellence drive, and that's where you do a lot of digitization, you do a lot of automation, but essentially more or less everything is focused with regards to driving efficiencies, productivity, and so on. So you can have all of that. Once you've cleared that level, we typically get into the middle level, and that's what we talk about, looking at innovation, right? Again, different organizations, different setups have different definitions of how they would want to drive innovation, but then that's your central layer, and that's what we get into when we say, okay, from a traditional approach, we take care of the low-hanging fruits, we drive our efficiencies, we drive our productivity, what next? We go into innovation, and we try to figure out, okay, how can we leverage some additional tool sets to drive what we so call as innovation. And then on the top of the layer is what we call transformation, and this is the area that we are all focusing on, right? So what exactly is transformation, and what defines the next generation of this industry? Well, again, this is more in terms of a teaser, right? So when we say, okay, we've got to move in, we've got to figure out what works for us. It's essentially what works for you. Because end of the day, there are organizations, there are companies who are ready to give you whatever they have, and from a technology abundance standpoint to what really floats your boat, end of the day, right? And that's most important in my perspective. So how would you like to go about it? Would you like to go about it from a typical market research which gets you a set of options, ideas, or directions to go ahead? Or would you like to go ahead with something where you leverage insight, internal, to whatever you have, and you go ahead and do your insight research and figure out what would be the 4 areas or 5 areas or 3 areas that you would like to get into, which is what you are saying as the next generation of BPO or an organization that you would want to be a part of. Well, again, there's no right or wrong, right? Anything which works for you works best. In my view, the insights from a research coming out from whatever data that you have generated over a period of time allows you to take a very, very objective look in terms of what does your customer want. How are you looking at the area that you want to get into? Customer experience is the key, right? And the data insights that we're talking about, which drives demand, which drives the consumption pattern, which drives the behavior, Now, typically, when we look at this, we talk about a traditional inside-out value chain, right? Most of the organizations have typically grown by looking at, okay, what are my core competencies? What is the current business model that I have, right? What else could we offer? What other channels could we use? And what customers do we want to sell to, right? This is the perceived customer value, which is the functional benefit minus the functional cost, right? Most of the industries, most of the organizations till a certain time were driven primarily through this approach, which was the inside-out approach. Look at what the data which is getting generated in terms of, I was just reading up some stats earlier today, and I was completely foxed to realize that we are generating close to about 320 million terabytes of data every day, probably more. Now imagine that on an annualized basis, how much of that data is getting generated and who uses that data? And how would you actually make sense out of the data? Because this data can as well be a boon or a bane depending upon how you use it, and therefore the need of leveraging AI, ML technologies to get us that insights that we're talking about. Another of my colleague earlier mentioned about predictive, prescriptive, diagnostic. Now all of these actually leveraged properly gives us the insights that we're looking at, right? And obviously there's no end to this. You've got to apply whatever again suits you and you go ahead. In alternation to that, how about we consider an outside-in value chain once again? We go a little different and we say, what customers do we want and what are their priorities? What ecosystem exists to meet these priorities? And we're talking about our own ecosystems, right? What could we offer? What business design would create the desirable profits here? And what do we need to do to execute that demand? Here, the customer experience is the emotional benefit without the hassle that we're talking about. Let's look at a few examples. Let's probably spend a few minutes. As I promised, I'm not going to make this tech heavy. I'm going to probably keep it a little lighter and give my perspective out of the way I have been driving a whole bunch of innovation and service excellence across my organization that I'm attached with now. But let's look at how we have propelled this particular element. We're talking about, let's say, an industry where we have a combination of two elements and what I would probably call as a digital twin. What does that do? It allows us to map what does somebody need and how can that need be fulfilled. Let's look at examples like an Uber. Right? What did Uber do? Uber never went ahead and tried to create a product of its own. All that it did was that it realized that there is a set of people who need to commute, they don't want to own, and again I had another of my speakers talk about earlier in terms of how do we map into the demand or the requirement of the consumer. And here it was a company which realized that the cost of ownership of a vehicle or taking the vehicle out in huge traffic probably doesn't make sense. So what came out was Uber. Airbnb is one more such example. What did they do? They went out to look at the outside-in value chain and they went about asking within themselves from a design perspective on what are they trying to solve for. Airbnb solved for people, vacation homes, and availability of a lot of these homes which were probably not used. And there you have a model which is called Airbnb. Let's take another example, and this is pretty near to our place here. We all know about this company called Big Basket, right? Now Big Basket came in, looked at the opportunity of people looking and wanting to have their groceries and their essentials delivered to their doorsteps rather than going to a shop outside, right, and picking it up. again, that's a hassle element, right? And again, we can all argue who wants to go and touch and feel vis-a-vis looking at a console and looking at the product and saying, hey, can this be delivered to my place? But Big Basket did that. And by the way, Big Basket reached a unicorn status in what, some 8 or 9 years. Let's look at another organization which is in the making, right? So while Big Basket addressed a huge requirement which got fulfilled in terms of consumers wanting to have groceries delivered to them, here was another organization which was thinking, hey, while that is something which I need for my monthly stacking up, I need something now, 10 minutes. Zepto. And when Zepto was launched and it said 10 minutes and you get your last minute items which you have forgotten delivered to your doorstep, we all said, well, this is crap. Nobody can deliver it to you in 10 minutes. And they are actually delivering while we are thinking they're delivering. What has Zepto done? And Zepto, by the way, is the latest unicorn in 2023. So what a Big Basket took 8 years, a Zepto probably has done it in what, a year or year and a half at most? So what is changing? We are witnessing a huge shift in terms of the mindset, in terms of how are we addressing a consumption pattern and then mapping our product and then mapping it along with the technology which enables the fulfillment which drives this industry. Now let's come back again to the BPO sector that we're talking about, right? So these are examples of emotional fulfillment without the hassle element. And that's exactly what we're talking. We want this industry to position itself into. How does this industry position itself as a transformation value creator? And this is where we're talking about the data insights. All the humongous amount of data which is getting generated through all the tools that we've heard, we've seen, or we are going to incorporate, we see a value based on the current need. How about generating something which allows us to go ahead and create something which allows a certain pattern, which can be done, which can be managed, and which can drive the next generation industry. Skills development. While we are talking about technology, we also have people. This is an industry which has been extremely people-centric. So how do we make sure that we are upskilling our set of people to be able to deliver to the needs while we have technology getting enabled to do that? Cost, of course, right? End of the day, we may argue that cost is not an element, but remember, this is something which 2 decades back, when I possibly just entered this particular industry, I was told that they will come in for the cost and they'll stay back for the value. It still happens, right? And as we move ahead, and possibly this is the last slide which I'm going to leave as a thinking note for all of you, right? What does the future readiness hold for this industry? We spoke about the proactive work upskilling. Therefore, how do we make sure that we are generating a pipeline, a future pipeline of talent, and which is also, by the way, mapped into the NASSCOM BPM priorities for 2023. Very, very critical. Are we creating those kinds of talent pipeline which is ready when you deploy your artificial intelligence-led technology? And now coming to the AI, ML technology being deployed to run and get to the next generation. We spoke a lot about generative AI, right? And generative AI is very, very critical. Let's take an example of a chatbot, right? We're talking about leveraging a chatbot which generates the knowledge for one, answering and addressing questions for the person who's trying to reach out to the company in terms of getting an answer, right? And when we talk about that, what is that generative AI doing? It's essentially looking at capturing that, okay, what are the typical reasons for which this person is calling me and how can I address and answer that? And when he's doing all of that, he's getting into the next generation or the next mode or the next module, which is called the conversational AI, wherein he's getting into, addressing issues which possibly were not thought through, or which possibly the bot itself is thinking through in terms of the answers to go ahead and reply or respond to a customer query. And while they're doing all of this, mind you, we are freeing up the time and the energy of the human, right? And this is the digital FTE, as we used to call it, and that's the human or the person FTE that we're talking. What do we do with that person who is now freed up from this menial repetitive task, but who can now mine the data which is getting generated through the generative AI or the conversational AI to actually focus on that particular market or that industry in terms of saying, hey, this could be the focus area, or this could be the product for this particular segment, or this particular client base, or this particular market which you can position it to. And that's what as an industry we are heading towards. Well, of course, beyond all of this, I think one more thing which comes up, and I'm very much cognizant that I've probably come very closer or run out of my time. But the last and not the least is, while we do all of this, we've also got to look at moving away from the metro sites. And that's where, at least we as an organization, we are exploring a lot of micro sites or moving away from the metros to get into your locations where you have a reasonably low cost but high talent base. And you develop, and that's how we all grow, not only for that particular site, that city, that company, but also as a country. And I think those are the future readiness elements that I would probably leave you with. And I think that's my last slide, and I've run out of time. So thank you so much for being a patient listener, and I'm absolutely open for any questions.
Thank you so much, Ranjan sir, for your insightful session.